Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Lucore Automotive. Finally time to shoot a very interesting episode, something I've been looking forward to for the last 3 years. This is the iron-headed Big Block Wars. We've got a 454 Chevy, we've got a 455 Pontiac, we've got a 455 Oldsmobile, and we have a 451 Mopar. All iron-headed Big Block Wars, kind of. They're basically all built to be kind of the same motor, all pretty close to apples. We're gonna go deep dive on each motor and discuss maybe what's the best. My flame suit's on, I'm ready to go. This should be an interesting episode. So this has been a really long-term video for us. To be honest with you, we've been kind of working towards this video for about 3 years now. In different projects that we've worked on, we've had these motors that were built to go into those vehicles. Now, fortunately, these three are our motors for our vehicles, so they didn't get put in vehicles yet because we have customer stuff to work on. The 454 Chevy has already been put back in its vehicle and has gone down the road to that customer, so I don't have it here with me today. But I do have all the information about it, and we are going to go through everything that we did with that vehicle. But this has been something we've been working on for about 3 years now. We wanted to make this a very honest comparison of the Chevy, the Pontiac, the Olds, the Mopar. Who does it better? Who does it cheaper? Who does it easier to work on? Parts availability. There's a lot of things that you can have a conversation about here, and we wanted to do it because everybody has their favorites. We all wear our badge on our arm. We're a GM guy, we're a Mopar guy, we're a Ford guy, whatever. We wanted to go, okay, well, let's take all that out of the equation and let's run an honest comparison. So all 4 of these motors are all built for street cars. They're all on pump gas, about 9.5 to 1 compression. They're all designed to be able to run vacuum assisted brakes, so they actually have some vacuum in them. They're not crazy cammed out of the moon. They're all essentially using basic stock parts or slightly upgraded basic stock parts. We didn't do any kind of crazy high-rise intakes. We didn't do anything 13 to 1 compression where you switch it over to alcohol. There's not anything that's crazy trickery here. They're just good quality builds that you would see in a good quality rebuild like you might do yourself. So without any further ado, let's start out with a 1970s era 454 Chevy. So the Chevy 454, this was purchased in the mid 80s as a LS6, essentially what you would find in like a 454 Chevelle in the early 70s. It was a GM Performance crate motor and ran about 9.5 to 1 compression. It had done considerable amount of mileage in the hot rod truck that it was in, but it needed a refresh. It had some serious oil leaks and had some other issues that needed to be handled. So that motor came out and it went over and went through the rebuild process. Now, the rebuild on this was a little bit unusual in that the bores were still in pretty good shape, and this was kind of a low buck rebuild. There wasn't a lot that was thrown at this thing. It had the original stock pistons from the GM crate motor, had the original rods, had the original crank, all of which have been cleaned up and ready to go, but they were not an overboard piston. They were very, very capable from the factory, from GM Performance in the first place. Now, the camshaft was changed because the camshaft that was originally in that motor was designed to be much more of a hot rod motor where you'd be running around 5,000 to 6,000 to 7,000 RPMs versus something that was more designed for truck usage. That particular truck, the owner, Mark Coben, wanted to be able to use his truck as a truck to be able to haul a trailer with Harleys in the back of it. And so the cam was adjusted and run a lower power band to be able to make more power for longer at the lower end instead of being a big screaming high cam kind of motor. The heads that were on that are Big Block Chevy heads. They are some of the best flowing heads you're going to buy anywhere from any factory, period. They are what they are. They've had a little bit of work done to them, nothing serious, just some bowl blending, but they do start out of the box as probably the best cast iron heads you're going to really buy across all of the brands. The new camshaft was from LucoreRacing. It is also a hydraulic roller cam. It also does have a full roller assembly that's in this motor. That is the only caveat with the 454 Chevy, is it does have a roller cam and roller rockers. None of the rest of these have that situation. But as you can see, the output off that Chevy was pretty impressive. And it sounded pretty good too. So yeah, sounds great, sounds hot roddy. Gorgeous torque curve on it. It's got a really nice flat torque curve and it carries it out nicely. That long torque curve, as we talk about in the hot rod world, the time under the curve, doesn't really matter what your peak power is, but if you make a lot of power for a long time, that's better than a whole lot of power for a very short period of time, at least in our world. So at 2,600 RPMs, this motor was making 450 foot-pounds of torque. It carried 450 foot-pounds of torque or more all the way to 5,500 RPMs where it starts to taper off, and it does honestly taper off pretty significantly from there. Max torque was at 4,500 RPMs. It made 493.2 foot-pounds of torque. Max horsepower was 472.4 at 5478. So it's still a better revving motor than a lot of the big blocks are. It is designed to be able to pull that well. A function of that is probably because the heads breathe really well. They are good at getting air in and out and even into the higher rev range. A lot of your big blocks are designed to not spin very fast, and one of the things that clearly, if you've ever had a big block Chevy, you know that those motors are actually capable of breathing up into the higher RPMs. This motor wasn't specifically designed to go that high, but it still was capable of being quite a bruiser even at 5,500 RPMs. So great motor, very simple rebuild, nothing real crazy that was in there, and it's definitely able to propel that 57 GMC truck very, very well. So next up, let's go to the Olds 455. This is this guy here. This is designed as a drop-in motor for Rich, the owner of Lucore Automotive's 1965 Oldsmobile F85. This was actually kind of an interesting story. He bought this block and rotating assembly all assembled. It had been sitting in a gentleman's garage I think he bought it off Craigslist, and got it for a steal. So he brought it back, and it had already been punched 30 over. It already had Speed Pro pistons in it, and he blew it all apart, verified everything, threw the bearings away, and then reassembled the bottom end. Now, he did do some things that need to be done on big block Oldsmobiles. There's a lot of things you can do as far as oiling and such to keep the oil on the bottom end, not just pumped up on the top. So he did do a bunch of stuff from Mondello, as well as you could see the upgraded oil pan to keep the oil where it needs to be and not over pump that oil up onto the top end. Now, one caveat on this, the 454 did run a dual plane intake. This is running a Torker, Edelbrock Torker intake. So this is a little bit different intake than what we had on all of the other motors. But it's got Speed Pro pistons that are 30 over. It has factory rods that have been reconned. It has a factory crank that has been polished. None of this stuff is crazy. It's all just cleaned up and put back together again. It does have a set of Speedmaster aluminum heads that are on here. This is the only one of all of them that is running an aluminum head setup. The aluminum heads in this case didn't really gain him much. You're still in the 9.5 to 1 compression ratio. They do take some weight off the front end of the motor, and you do get a lot better heat dissipation off of the aluminum. They do flow a little bit better than a good cast iron head, but not overly so. Not really slanting anything that badly. But would be, full honesty, this is running aluminum heads. Now, these are out-of-the-box Speedmaster heads, so they're not the greatest heads in the world. We didn't put $3,000 worth of heads on this thing. We had them checked at the machine shop. They said that everything was pretty good to go, and I believe we changed springs on them, and then set it off to go. Here it is on the dyno. Another pretty good motor. This has got a Pingle racing cam. It is a flat tappet cam. Again, the only thing we didn't have that was, or the only thing we had that was not a flat tappet was the 454 Chevy. Sounds good, looks good, make great oil pressure, very responsive, excellent little motor. There was not a lot of trickery in the machine work on this. This is a pretty much bare bones 455. With, as I said, the oil restrictions and the things that needed to be done to make this thing run really well. But nothing crazy. There's no black magic from machine shops that was involved in this. So, let's talk power. This did make the 450 foot-pounds of torque number slightly later than the Chevy did. It made it at 3,000 RPMs. It carried that 450 foot-pounds of torque all the way up to 5,100 RPMs. So, that rev range is a little bit shorter. That can go down to a couple of different things, to be honest with you. We can go into depth with that a little bit later on down the road. At 4,000 RPMs, it made its max torque, which was 497.6. That is actually slightly better than the 454 Chevy was. Max horsepower was 434.2 at 5,093 RPMs. So again, a pretty nicely revving motor. It doesn't carry it nearly as well as the Big Block Chevy did. Again, we can go back to the conversation of those Big Block Chevy heads really flow well in the higher RPMs. Also, the roller assembly that was in there and the roller camshaft probably frees up some of that power, especially up into the higher RPMs. So, great little motor. It's going to be a scorcher in the F85 Olds. Very, very proud of what this thing did, and honestly, of all of the motors we worked on, this was probably the least expensive build, which is saying quite a lot because none of these are really that inexpensive. But for the money he had in it, it's going to be a hell of a good motor. We're very, very excited to see what this thing does in that Oldsmobile. This is an FA block from the early 70s, so it's about as comparable as our next thing we're going to talk about, which is my Pontiac 455 build. Now, this 455 is a 1970 455. It came out of my 1970 Pontiac Le Mans. It is not the original motor that was in that car. This car I purchased personally because it was not stock. It had a bunch of things that had been done to it and a bunch of things that had been swapped out. And I wasn't going to be worried about the fact that it's not stock, so I could do whatever I wanted to with it. It already had 6X heads on it. It had the 1970 block, which matches the 1970 car. So, it ran pretty reasonably well when we pulled it out. We actually did dyno test this thing, and it did considerably better, honestly, than I thought that it would do. It did have some oil leaks. It did have some oil burn issues. There was a bunch of other issues that I was seeing in that car that I wanted to be able to address, and I honestly didn't trust the motor from what I saw from the other things, so that's what started this rebuild. Now, this is a 30 over. It's got SRP pistons in it. It's got Eagle rods. It has the original 455 crankshaft. It's been polished. So you end up somewhere in around the range of 461 cubic inches. Essentially exactly the same as what you have with this Olds 455. The 6X heads have been completely rebuilt. New valves, retainers, springs, keepers, you name it, everything has been redone inside of these 6X heads. Now, with that said, these are not highly worked 6X heads. Anybody who's a Pontiac guy knows you can squeeze all kinds of power out of these heads. You send them off and have them ported and polished and all the black magic wizardry that machine shops can do. You can find a lot of power in these heads. That was not what we were looking to do here. This was going to be essentially a OEM plus comparison of what good stuff from the different manufacturers would truly honestly make and compare them across the board. So, could we have squeezed more power out of these 6X heads on this combination? Absolutely. Could we have thrown a single plane intake on this thing and made more power? Absolutely. There's a lot of things we could have done, but then we wouldn't have had this comparison that we're trying to give you guys as an honest-to-God comparison of what these things really actually make. The Pontiac 455, running exactly the same billet distributor as the Olds is. 9.5 to 1 compression. Nothing crazy going on as far as any of that stuff goes. It's got a custom grind cam from Comp Cams. Again, nothing crazy. Still capable of running power vacuum-assisted brakes. But it did very, very well, and I was very happy with it. Our power came in a little bit earlier than this, but not quite as early as the Big Block Chevy. We hit our 450 foot-pounds of torque mark at 2,800 RPMs, and we carried that all the way to 5,100 RPMs. Peak torque came in a little bit lower than what this guy came in, and a lot lower than the Big Block Chevy did, at 3,700 RPMs. It made 515 foot-pounds of torque, which was actually a little bit surprising for us. The max horsepower on it was 436.4 at 5049. Now we did also play around with using an adapter on this and did a spacer. That spacer did give us an extra 4 horsepower. So technically speaking, it did at one point in time make 440 horsepower. But that 4 extra horsepower cost us 10 foot-pounds of torque. Now, this is also a quadrijet intake that's on this. We were using a 4150 adapter that's on there to be able to make this all work. We also did run this on a quadrijet. It made similar power. It needed to be adjusted, made some tune adjustments with it, but it made very similar power. All of these motors, all 4 of them, ran on the same Demon carburetor on this dyno. So we tried to take that out of the equation. This motor is probably going to go back in that car with a quadrijet back on it because that's much more true to Pontiac form. And I have a freshly rebuilt quadrijet that is going to sit on here and be able to make some nice Pontiac power for me. Full disclosure here, this has had a lot of machine shop trickery. The ring package is kind of tricky. A lot of the upgrades and tricks that you can do in the machine shop world to free up some power have been done to this motor. Now, we didn't do any porting and polishing to the heads, but as far as the bottom end goes, it's pretty solid. There's a lot of tricks that they've been using in this. Now, unfortunately, those tricks cost money. So the question you ask yourself at that point in time is, does it make sense to spend the extra several hundred to a couple $1,000s to have professional machining done and to have all of the trickery done to be able to increase the performance of this motor and, quite honestly, the longevity of the motor versus building a kind of a low buck, true low buck motor like this Oldsmobile was. Essentially speaking, we're talking maybe I got 20 foot-pounds of torque and 5 horsepower or so on this versus this. I have a slightly longer torque table than the Oldsmobile does. But again, it costs a bit more money to be able to do that correctly. Now you also do have the Pontiac tax, which things are more expensive for Pontiacs. Everybody builds big block Chevys. Not everybody builds big block Pontiacs. Same can kind of be honestly said for the Oldsmobile. They share a very similar tax. Same with the Buicks. If you ever build a Buick 455, you know they're great motors, but parts are a bit more expensive, and they're not nearly as readily available as it is to be able to build a small block or big block Chevy. So that's my Pontiac 455. It was a pretty good motor. I'm pretty happy with it. It's very, very capable. I'm very much excited to get it in my 1970 Pontiac, and that will be done as soon as the AMC is done. Promise, it'll be done. All right, so we've got the Pontiac done, we've got the Oldsmobile done, we've got the Chevy done. Let's talk about this Mopar. Now, this Mopar is a little bit of an odd duckling, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a backstory on it. So this is a 1977 400 block. Came out of a half-ton pickup truck. The purpose of this build is to go into 73 Charger chick Katrina Bell's 1973 Dodge Charger. When she purchased that car, it had already been swapped from the original 318 that was in the car to a 1973 400. It's a smog era 400. It's not got a lot of guts, but we enjoy the big block, and it's already there. So it got us thinking, what if we did a better version of that 400 that's in there and made this happen? Well, for those of you who are not familiar with Mopars, most people would swap into a 440. And sure, that's a great motor, and there's a ton of people out there that are showing all kinds of amazing things out of the 440. The 400 is a little bit less of a desirable motor, so they're not really worth anything. I bought this motor from a guy off of Craigslist for $180, carb to pan. But the trick is, with the 400s, is you can shove the rotating assembly out of a 440 with some machining into one of these, and it makes a stroker kit out of your 400. So that makes it a 451 cubic inch off of a 400, which gets us within striking distance of what all the other guys were as far as our cubic inches go. The other nice thing with doing that rotating assembly is it does cut down on your rotating assembly mass. The weight comes down because you're cutting materials off that 440 mass, which gives you some really good revving capabilities. And the 440 stuff in the early 70s was very, very stout, so we could throw quite a bit of abuse at it. So, as I said, this was a 1977 400 block out of a half-ton pick-em-up truck. Rotating assembly-wise, it has the 440 crank that has been turned to be able to fit the 400, as well as the original 440 rods, the matching set of 440 rods with the original crank. On top of those, we loaded a set of Icon pistons and got ourselves right to that 9.6 to 1 compression ratio. Very comfortable to run on pump gas. We didn't want anything where we're going to have to run crazy gas to be able to get this thing down the road. She does drive this car pretty reasonably often. It does have a dual plane Edelbrock intake manifold on it, exactly the same setup we saw on the Chevy as well as on the Pontiac. It is running a set of motorhome heads, and this is a kind of a complicated conversation to have. We can have that conversation elsewhere, but these are not the best heads that Mopar made by any means. They are basically just a factory cast head. They were not anything special. They're not the best of the best. They're not the worst. We did replace everything in them. So new valves, new springs, new keepers, new all the stuff has all been replaced. It is factory size stuff. One thing that we did realize once we started working on this thing, and we wanted to have this as a cast iron motor to be able to compare it to the other ones, was not a lot of people rebuild cast iron Mopar motors. So parts were not really readily available, and even better stuff for the cast iron really wasn't available. So we put essentially basic stock stuff back in it. It wasn't anything crazy. It does have a custom ground camshaft from Comp Cams. It is a flat tappet camshaft. It's got 1.6 rockers from PRW. But otherwise, it's basically just a 451 cubic inch version of the 383 and the 400 Mopars from the mid-70s, late 70s. Did pretty dang well, and sounds pretty dang good. Power levels on this thing actually came in pretty quick, almost as quick as we saw in the 454 Chevrolet. At 2,700 RPMs, we crossed that 450 foot-pounds of torque mark, and we carried that all the way to 4,900 RPMs. Max torque was at 4,000 RPMs, and we achieved 486.7 foot-pounds of torque. Max horsepower was achieved at 4,900 RPMs. We hit 420.5 horsepower. Now, we were all very happy with the results. It made pretty good power for what it is. It's not a screamer by any means. There are certainly some opportunities left in this motor. The setup that's in here is not really perfect. To be honest with you, we were battling valve float pretty seriously. At 5,000 RPMs, as you can see in the dyno graph, it starts to get real angry. You have a valve float issue that, as you can see, the power is still building nicely in the horsepower on the curve, and the torque is still maintaining there, but we're starting to fall apart there. So I think there's definitely still some horsepower left to be scrounged out of this thing. I would say it would probably get somewhere between what we see with the Oldsmobile and the Pontiac, were we to spend the extra time and money and effort to figure out exactly what needed to be fixed to be able to squeeze out that extra little bit of rev range. Because realistically speaking, with the rotating assembly that's in this, that rotating assembly should rev better than all of the other ones do because it's physically lighter. It should be able to hit 5,500 RPMs, even to 6,000 RPMs. A lot of people rev these motors to 6 grand, and they can make very considerable power. Now, fixing those problems will not add more torque to us. So our torque number is probably exactly where it would be. What it would do is it would draw that torque number out a little bit further, which would generate us more horsepower over the RPM range. So that's where this thing was. Great motor, we're very happy with it. Looks awesome. It's going to look great under the hood of her 1973 Dodge Charger. Very excited to get this project moving forward. Now this brings us to a very interesting point in the conversation. All of these motors would benefit from better heads. To be honest with you, this is the only one that has aluminum heads on it, and even having these heads worked would probably net some considerable power. The Pontiac absolutely would benefit from a set of aluminum heads. The Mopar would be a huge difference with a good set of aluminum heads. The Big Block Chevy, absolutely, it would pick up some power with the aluminum heads. Probably not as good because the factory Chevy LS6 heads that are on there are excellent heads. So it would pick up power, but it wouldn't certainly be as much as you would see with the Pontiac, and it definitely wouldn't be the percentage improvement you would see with the Mopar. So this has been kind of a big block iron-headed show-off to see what they really do, to be honest. All in the same dyno, all basically built in exactly the same way, all very close as far as displacement goes, and to see, you know, which one's the best. Now, which one's the best? Whew. Well, let's look at a couple of things. From a price-wise, either the Oldsmobile or the Chevy. But you got to take that caveat of the fact that Rich got a smoking good deal on the bottom end of this. If we penalize him $2,000 for what he would essentially have spent to have the block machined and the crank turned and new rods and pistons and all the other stuff, yeah, you gotta hand it to the Big Block Chevy. It was inexpensive. It was simple. You can get parts for it instantly. If you don't have it at the local engine builder, they can get it from one of their suppliers, usually within a day. Tons of things that are available for that motor. You can get everything you need from Jegs. They're right down the street from here. And you could build yourself a screaming Big Block Chevy pretty simply. I mean, there's a reason everybody built Big Block Chevys for their hot rods, right? So, with that said, cost-wise, I'll give it to the Chevy. Second place, I would probably say the Oldsmobile. It really wasn't terribly expensive to build this motor. The parts were reasonably available. It wasn't super complicated. There wasn't anything real interesting to do here. It's just a Big Block 455 that's punched over with some stock shelf pistons. And it did a very good job for what it was and for the amount of money and energy that was put into this thing. Not saying Rich didn't work hard putting this motor together. He certainly did. But there wasn't any kind of trickery. This was just kind of, it is what it is. As for the Pontiac, I love my Pontiac. I'm a Pontiac guy. I'm very proud of what this motor did. I loved cresting 500 foot-pounds of torque. It did cost more than all of the other motors. It did take a long time. Getting the machining done, getting parts in, it's not nearly as easy to do as a Big Block Chevy is. The BOP guys, Buick, Olds, and Pontiac, know that there's a cost for running something that's not a Big Block Chevy. It's a great motor. Makes boatloads of torque. Makes it for a nice long period of time. Realistically speaking, it's more than enough for powering that 1970 Le Mans into a very respectable quarter mile, and it's still very street drivable. The sound of it is fantastic. I absolutely love it. But it was more expensive and it did take longer to build. So it's kind of hard to say. I love the vehicle. The problem you're going to run into is parts availability. You can't get it as quickly. They're not as easily readily supported. But it's also kind of fun to be able to have something much more unique than just another Chevy underneath the hood of something. So I love this motor. I'm glad I built it. I'm excited to have it in my car and making some great sounds and doing some big nasty burnouts. So the last thing to talk about is this big block Mopar. And to be honest with you, this gets a little bit complicated. I would probably build this motor essentially exactly how I built it over again. This Oldsmobile, I would probably build this Oldsmobile basically exactly how it is. The Chevy, it's perfect. Don't worry about it, it's great. Put it back in the truck and have a good time. The Mopar is a different animal, and I didn't know before we started this project. To be very honest with you, this is the very first big block Mopar that I have built, that Rich has built, or that our engine builder had built. They had built ones that are, money is no object kind of big block builds, or RB motors, not the B motors. But were I to do this again, I would build it differently. The availability of stroker kits for these Bs are incredible. For the amount of money we spent on a factory 440 rods, pistons, and crank, we could have put a 499 cubic inch stroker kit in this thing for honestly probably less money. And it would just drop right in. We wouldn't have to do anything to grind to make sure that the counterweights are done. We wouldn't have to do any kind of, there's nothing to do. You can buy them from Eagle, you can buy them from Scat. And taking a 400 cubic inch big block to essentially 500 cubic inches, how do you hate on that? That's not an option for these guys. You can do that in the tall deck Chevys, but a tall deck Chevy block is considerably harder to get a hold of and more expensive than a B-Series Mopar. You can find these things in a junkyard without a problem. All you need is the block. So if I were to do it again, yeah, I would absolutely go the route of an aftermarket crank, rods, and pistons and make this thing essentially a 500 cubic inch big block. Same probably goes for the heads. There are a lot of options as far as Mopars go with heads. You can run all kinds of different things. Same things with Pontiac. There's all kinds of different heads that you can run that move your compression around, that have different size valves, that have different setups on them. There's a lot of range that you can get into, and you can certainly squeeze more power out of these big block Mopar heads that are cast iron. But the honest question becomes a question of money. Why would you with the big block Mopar heads? As inexpensive as they are, and let's segue that into a conversation now about heads. The money, especially on the Mopar side of things, to me was quite shocking. Given this is my first foray down the hole of Mopars, the pricing was incredible. These guys are both a couple $100. For a good set of Edelbrock out-of-the-box heads, you're going to have $1,100 to $1,200 pretty easily in these guys, in Buick Olds Pontiac, depending on what you're looking for, somewhere in that range. $1,100, $1,200, $1,300, $1,400, somewhere in that range. If you're going to send them off to somebody like Butler Performance for Pontiac, they're going to have a bit more into them, but they can make them an even better head. When you get into the Mopar side of things, they're way less expensive, like 30% less expensive than the big block Pontiacs, Olds, and those guys. So for a set of Edelbrock heads, even if you replace some of the pieces that are not that great in Edelbrock heads, you have less money involved in buying a set of ready-to-run heads out of the box from Indy or Mancini Racing or 440 Source or whomever. You have less money in way better heads that weigh less, that dissipate heat better, that flow better, that have better angles on the spark plugs, that have everything better than working a set of these cast iron heads. So if we were to do this again, would I do the aluminum head upgrade? Absolutely. Would this thing make incredible amount of power with 500 cubic inches with an aluminum set of heads on it? Oh yeah. Would it break everything in the car? Possibly. Because the amount of power that you would be unleashing on this thing would be considerably beyond what this is. Now this is a very stout motor, don't get me wrong. It's going to be a great motor for what she's going to do for it for right now. The camshaft that's in this thing is already ready to rock and roll for the aluminum head upgrade, which is definitely in the cards. So once she's comfortable driving this motor will probably have those old cast iron heads taken off and brand new aluminum heads put on it, and it's going to free us up a whole bunch more power and a bunch more rev range to be able to make it a much more fun motor. The Oldsmobile, this has its set of aluminum heads on it. They're not going to get touched. This makes enough power right now for what it is. It's going to be fine. At some point in time, maybe it gets nitrous, maybe it gets some sort of forced induction on it. It's possible. The heads are not the best heads, but they still flow better than factory stuff, and they're capable of doing considerably more. The Pontiac, honestly, I don't think that I'm going to end up doing aluminum heads on it. It's so expensive to do. I can't stomach spending essentially $3,000 or thereabouts on a set of aluminum heads for this motor right now. It just doesn't make any sense to me. It makes plenty of power. It's just that Pontiac tax is expensive. Were I to do it, I would absolutely get a set of heads from either Kaufman or Butler. I would have a set of heads that are ready to rock and roll out of the box, that have good quality components, and I would bolt those things on and I'd let this thing eat, and it would make considerably more power than it makes now because it can breathe better and it can get into that rev range further. It's just expensive, and I wouldn't do it. On the Big Block Chevy, for what it is, I wouldn't touch it. It makes more than enough power to have a lot of fun with. It's the best of all of the worlds. Hey, you know what? There's a reason Big Block Chevys ruled everything, right next to their small block Chevy cousins. So, maybe not earth-shattering, but there's an honest comparison. Of all of them, what's my favorite? Honestly, the Mopar. I think the potential is incredible. I think it's one of those things that most people don't know about, including myself up until very recently. I think the ability to be able to make 500 cubic inches out of a big block that revs just exactly how a 400 would, that can create incredible amounts of power, that's cheap, that you can find parts for very, very easily. It's a killer combination. It really is. It's very unique also, and I love seeing when you pop the hood of something. I love seeing something that's just not a LS or a big block Chevy. I'm sorry, I do. Now, you know, obviously the Chevys keep their big block Chevys, but in the Pontiac world, if you pop the hood and you see a LS under the hood or a big block Chevy under the hood, you kind of feel like, oh, you know, hey, my flame suit's on, guys. But anyway, there you go. That is our honest to God, as apples to apples as we can give you, iron-headed big block wars between the Chevy 454, the Pontiac 455, Oldsmobile 455, and Mopar 451. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed this. I'm sure the comments are going to get interesting about what you think is the best, why you think I'm an idiot, what I should have done differently, how you built it cheaper and better in your garage over the weekend. I'm interested to hear what you guys say. We always appreciate comments. Please do click on that subscribe button. All of these vehicles will be built here in the very near future, so you can see these motors actually running and in their vehicles. They all also will be going to a chassis dyno over at CIA Performance to be able to see what actual numbers they make on a chassis dyno in the vehicle, fully loaded with accessories. We're also going to be taking their 1965 Buick GS with a 455 Buick Stage 1 motor and putting it on that same dyno and seeing what numbers it makes, so we can use it as a rough comparison to what these things make as far as what they are. So if you're interested in that, make sure you subscribe. As always, we appreciate you guys watching. We hope you've enjoyed this. It's been a little bit entertaining and at least a little bit educational. We'll see you in the comments. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.